What happens when the Wolf King's daughter, feared by all, finally finds someone brave enough to face her darkness? Could a humble janitor be the one to heal her? No one dared to care for the Wolf King's daughter, not after what happened to the others. They said no one would last a night in her presence, not a single mortal. Then came Mara, one humble janitor, one whispered lullaby, one impossible moment that would change everything. There was a woman no one thought to notice, a single mother, invisible in the grand halls of Wolfstone Castle. She was only there to clean the floors and wipe away the dust, nothing more. Yet it was her, Mara Quinn, who would shatter what had seemed unshatterable. Because the girl everyone feared, the daughter of the Wolf King Alaric, was untouchable. Princess Lyra, once a symbol of hope for her kingdom, had become a living curse. No one could soothe her grief, no one could break through her rage. Her power was as wild as the wolves her father ruled, and like those beasts, it was merciless. Lyra had once been the heartbeat of Wolfstone, a child of laughter and light. She ran through the halls, her mother's love filling every corner of the castle. That was before the grief consumed her. Now, the only sound echoing through the ancient walls of the castle was the screech of glass shattering, the howl of dark magic, the weight of a child's sorrow too great to bear. 23 caretakers had come and gone, each one fleeing in terror or losing themselves in the storm that raged inside the princess. Not a single person, not even the greatest mages in the land, could reach her. Until one night, Mara, the janitor with nothing but the softness of a song, did what no one else could. She stayed. That night, Mara had no idea what she was walking into. She was just doing her job, mopping the cold marble floors, when the sound of Lyra's cries reached her ears, a sound so full of grief it seemed to shake the castle itself. She had heard children cry before, heard the desperate wails of her own son when illness gripped him, but this was different. This was the cry of a soul lost, a heart broken by forces beyond its control. Without thinking, Mara set aside her mop, her worn hands trembling, and stepped toward the door that everyone else had been afraid to open. She didn't know it then, but that simple action would change everything. And that was just the beginning. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and tell us, what city are you watching from? We'd love to hear where our viewers are tuning in from. For the next few days, Mara continued her work in Wolfstone Castle, mopping the halls, dusting the tapestries, and scrubbing the stone floors until her hands ached. The grand halls were as cold as the winds that howled outside, but the castle had a strange stillness to it, an unnatural quiet that made Mara uneasy. The whispers of the staff and the rumors that seemed to swirl around the princess only heightened the chill. They said she was cursed, that her magic was uncontrollable, that no one could touch her. But Mara didn't believe in curses. She believed in grief. And grief, she knew, could change everything. The princess's power was something neither Mara nor anyone else could see at first. It wasn't visible. Like fire or lightning, it was felt, like the weight of a storm before it broke. Lyra's powers were tied to her emotions, specifically the grief she carried, the grief of losing her mother, Queen Lyra, to a tragic and mysterious death. The sorrow had consumed her, weaving its darkness into her very being. When she cried, the magic tore through the castle, shattering glass, throwing furniture, and causing the walls to shake. The very air seemed to thicken with sorrow, until it felt as if the castle itself was mourning along with her. It wasn't just the power that made Lyra a threat. It was the isolation that came with it. She couldn't control her magic, and the more she tried, the more it spiraled out of her grasp. It was a cycle of rage and fear that had become the core of her existence. Each failed attempt to reach her only solidified her belief that she was beyond saving. She had driven away every caretaker, every mage, every person who dared to come close. Each one either fled in terror or was consumed by the curse themselves. The rumors had started as whispers among the staff, but as time went on, they spread like wildfire. The princess was a terror, a child of destruction. Some said that when she was angry, her magic could level mountains. Others claimed that the mere touch of her hand drained the life force from anyone who came near. The caretakers, those brave or foolish enough to try, had all left, or worse, died. Mara didn't know any of this when she was first assigned to clean near Lyra's chambers. She had heard the rumors, of course. Who hadn't? But she dismissed them. She wasn't afraid of ghosts or curses. She had her own ghosts, her own struggles to bear. She wasn't concerned with the princess's magic. She was just trying to make it through another day. Her first encounter with Lyra came when she was mopping the stone floors near the princess's chamber. It was late in the evening, and the halls were quiet, save for the faint sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the castle's old walls. As she passed by the half-open door to Lyra's room, she heard it. A cry. At first, it was soft, just a quiet sob, but then it escalated, turning into something much louder, more guttural. It wasn't the cry of a child. It was something deeper, something primal, filled with pain. Mara paused, mop in hand, staring at the door. She knew she should keep walking, mind her own business, but something in that cry tugged at her, a deep, gnawing ache in her chest, something that made her step closer to the door. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to find, or even if she was afraid. She wasn't. And so she pushed the door open slowly. What she saw through the crack of the door nearly made her recoil. Lyra was sitting on the floor, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. Her eyes were wide, glowing a crimson red, and her small hands were clenched tightly around her knees. Her silver hair, once so beautiful and full of life, now seemed to float around her like a ghost's veil, wild and untamed. The air around her seemed to crackle with raw energy, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees in an instant. It was like standing at the edge of a storm. And then Lyra screamed. It wasn't a scream of frustration, like a child throwing a tantrum. It was a scream of anguish, of sorrow so deep and unyielding that it felt like it could tear the castle apart. The windows rattled in their frames, and Mara felt the floor beneath her feet tremble. Glass shattered, the lights in the room flickered, and the cold air grew sharp and biting. Lyra's magic was a force of nature, uncontrollable, destructive, and fierce. But it was more than that. It was grief. Grief so powerful that it had twisted into something monstrous. Mara didn't step back. She didn't run. She stood there, frozen for a moment, watching the princess unravel in front of her. And despite the overwhelming fear that would have gripped anyone else, Mara saw something in Lyra's eyes. Pain. A pain that was as familiar to Mara as the ache in her own heart. Mara had lost someone too. Her husband, Thomas. She had loved him more than anything, and when he died, it felt like the world itself had stopped turning. She had carried that grief with her every day since, hidden behind her work and her duties as a mother. She understood what it was like to lose someone you loved beyond reason, beyond measure. And in that moment, as Lyra's power surged around her, Mara saw not a dangerous princess, but a broken child, trapped in a world of pain. The connection between them was unspoken but undeniable. Mara didn't know what made her do it. Maybe it was her own grief, or maybe it was the way Lyra's sorrow mirrored the emptiness Mara had carried for so long. Whatever it was, she knew she couldn't leave the princess in that state. So she did what no one else had done. She walked into the room. "Lyra," Mara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The princess didn't react at first, still hunched against the wall, her eyes glowing with that unnatural red light. But Mara took another step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what she was doing, but she couldn't just stand there. "I know your pain," Mara said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "I lost someone too, and I know what it's like to feel like the world is breaking." For a moment there was silence. The air around them seemed to settle, just for a heartbeat. Then Lyra's gaze shifted to Mara, and for the first time since Mara had entered the room, the magic around the princess began to wane. The energy in the room was still charged, but it was no longer violent. It was just grief. Lyra's voice, though weak and trembling, broke the silence. You understand?" Mara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, I do." Lyra's red eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Mara saw something almost human in them. She didn't know what to do next. She didn't have magic or any grand powers to offer. All she had was her presence, her understanding, and a willingness to just be there. And somehow, that seemed to be enough. From that night onward, Mara continued to visit Lyra. She wasn't a trained caretaker or a mage, but she was something else. Something Lyra had never had before. She was someone who saw her, truly saw her. And as the days passed, something began to shift in the princess who had once been feared, the child who could shatter the world with her grief, was starting to change, and no one knew it, not yet. But Mara had already begun to do what no one else could. She had begun to heal the Wolf King's daughter. Mara was not a woman of grand gestures. Her life, lived largely in the shadows of others, had never called for anything more than what was needed, what was expected. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't special. She was simply a mother trying to survive. Before the castle, before the whispers and the fearful stares, there had been a life filled with warmth, a life that was once whole. She had been married to Thomas, a man whose laughter had filled their home and whose touch had made everything feel right. Together, they had built a life, a family. Their son Daniel had been their joy, their reason to hope. But grief, as it often does, came like a thief in the night, stealing everything Mara held dear. Thomas had fallen ill one winter, his body consumed by a fever that neither healer nor prayer could stop. Mara had watched as the man she loved with all her heart wasted away, helpless to save him. She had held his hand until the end, whispering promises she couldn't keep, promises that, in the end, meant nothing. The silence that followed his death was suffocating. Her once lively home became cold, empty, a place she no longer recognized. It wasn't just the loss of Thomas that haunted her. It was the loneliness of raising Daniel alone, without the strength of her husband to lean on, and then Daniel fell ill. Her heart had shattered when she saw her son coughing, his small frame shaking with each breath. The same sickness that had claimed Thomas was now threatening to take him. For weeks, Mara fought to keep hope alive, running errands for the castle's healer, seeking help wherever she could. But deep down, she knew. It was a battle she couldn't win, not on her own. She had already lost once. Could she bear to lose again? She didn't let that fear show on her face. She couldn't afford to. Daniel needed her. He needed her to be strong, even if inside she was falling apart. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights that Mara found herself at the gates of Wolfstone Castle, knocking on the door of fate. She had heard about the work there, the opportunity for a steady income, something to help her keep a roof over her head and food in her son's mouth. The work was menial. Janitorial duties to clean the vast halls of the castle, to scrub floors and wash windows. It was hard work, but it was a job, and it came with the benefit of the castle's medical facilities. She had no idea what kind of life awaited her within the walls of Wolfstone, no understanding of the strange magical world that spun behind its doors. She only knew that it was a place that could offer her a chance, something that felt like a second chance. When Mara first started cleaning the castle's halls, she heard the rumors, whispers of a princess, Lyra, the Wolf King's daughter, a child who had been consumed by grief. A girl who could shatter glass with her screams, whose magic was untamable, who drove everyone away. People spoke of her in hushed tones, as though speaking her name out loud would invite her fury. None of it fazed Mara. She had faced the depth of loss. What could a child's grief possibly compare to the hollowness that gnawed at her own heart? She worked with quiet determination, cleaning the grand hallways, the dusty chambers, the forgotten corners of the castle. She never asked questions. She simply did her work, finding a quiet rhythm in the monotony. But every night, when the castle grew still and the wind howled outside, she heard it. A faint sobbing, a soft, heart-breaking sound that seeped through the walls and into her bones. The crying of a child, endless and filled with pain. It didn't matter that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge it. Mara did, and she couldn't ignore it. One evening, as she scrubbed the stone floor near the princess's chambers, the sound of crying reached her again, louder this time, more desperate. The walls of the castle trembled as if they too were burdened by the weight of Lyra's grief. Mara paused, her hand stilling on the mop. She had learned to ignore the world around her, to close her heart to the suffering of others. But something about the cry struck a chord deep within her. With a soft sigh, Mara set down the mop. Her heart hammered in her chest, a mixture of curiosity and compassion pulling her closer to the door. She had no right to intrude on the princess's grief, no reason to think she could help. But the cry, it sounded like Daniel's when he was sick, the ache, the helplessness. Slowly, she pushed the door open. Inside, Lyra was a storm of emotion, her body trembling, her hair wild in silver, her small hands clutching her knees. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, filled with pain and loss. It was as though the grief that consumed her had taken on a life of its own, swirling around her in dark, violent energy. The very air in the room seemed to crackle with it, cold and suffocating. Mara stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do. She had never seen anything like this. The princess was no child, not in the traditional sense. She was a force of nature, a being torn between the human and the monstrous. But Mara saw something in those eyes, the same emptiness she had seen in her own reflection after Thomas's death. It wasn't power, it was pain. It was the same ache she had carried for years, gnawing at her insides, and that was what made her move. She stepped inside, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floor. The room was filled with the echoes of Lyra's crying, but Mara didn't speak. She simply approached the princess, slowly and cautiously, as if she were walking toward something fragile. She didn't try to calm her, didn't try to fix anything. She just stayed there, waiting for Lyra to notice her. When Lyra's eyes finally turned toward her, there was a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps, or simply curiosity. But whatever it was, it stopped the storm for a moment. Lyra's breathing slowed, and the dark energy in the room seemed to lessen, if only for a brief second. Mara stood still, offering nothing but her presence. And then, without thinking, she hummed. It wasn't a spell, no magic words or incantations. It was simply a lullaby, a song her own mother had sung to her when she was a child, a song she had sung to Daniel when he had trouble sleeping. It was a simple, quiet tune, soft and steady, a reminder of love and comfort. To her surprise, Lyra stopped crying. The room still felt heavy with sorrow, but the intensity of it seemed to fade. Lyra's body relaxed, and for the first time in months, the princess slept. Mara didn't know how long she stood there, watching the child in her arms, but eventually the energy in the room shifted. It was not a victory, it was not a magic trick, it was simply a moment of peace, a small, quiet act of kindness, and that was enough. The next day, King Alaric was informed that someone had dared to enter Lyra's chambers. His reaction was immediate, furious, threatening, and cold. No one in the castle was allowed near the princess unless given explicit permission, and yet, here was a mortal woman, a janitor, daring to do what no one else had. His temper flared, and he demanded to know who had allowed Mara into his daughter's room. But as he paced his chambers, his mind racing with fury, something shifted. He had received report after report of caretakers who had fled in terror of the countless efforts to reach his daughter that had ended in failure. The idea of a simple servant, someone with no magical training, no royal blood, no power, bringing peace to Lyra was absurd. But there was something in the report that caught his attention. The way Lyra had reacted to her, the way her tears had stopped, the silence that had followed. He decided to observe. Mara was nothing more than a lowly janitor, but there was something in her that intrigued him, something that made him wonder if perhaps, after all these years, he had finally found someone who could reach his daughter in a way no one else could. And so King Alaric, the immortal ruler of Wolfstone, waited. He watched from a distance, his curiosity piqued. Could a single mother with no magic, no power, do what centuries of kings and mages could not? Could she truly calm the storm that raged within his daughter? The answer, he soon realized, would not be so simple. The days that followed were not easy. Mara could feel the weight of her presence in Wolfstone Castle, the subtle shift in the air when she entered certain rooms, the careful glances exchanged by the servants and staff as they watched her move through the halls. She knew what they whispered behind her back. She's mad to keep trying with the princess. But Mara didn't care about their judgment. She wasn't there for them. She was there for Lyra. Every night, Mara continued to visit the princess in secret, cleaning the chambers, tending to the room, and always sitting beside Lyra when the cries began. She hadn't known what to expect from the princess. What kind of child could shatter a room with her power? Yet, when she entered Lyra's space, she saw nothing but pain. For the first time, Mara understood that the storms Lyra unleashed were not born of malice. They were born of grief. Lyra's powers, as it turned out, were not the result of some curse or twisted magic. They were, in the simplest terms, a reflection of the deep sorrow that consumed her. Grief, as it often does, had taken root in her heart and spread to every part of her being until it wasn't just an emotional pain. It became a physical force, something she couldn't control, something that controlled her. Each time the princess cried, each time her emotions flared, the magic within her surged uncontrollably. At its worst, it was as though Lyra's pain itself was a living thing, tearing through the stone walls of Wolfstone Castle, threatening to swallow everything in its path. When she screamed, glass shattered, the temperature plummeted, and the castle itself seemed to tremble in fear of the magic she could not control. But it wasn't just power. Mara knew grief well. She had learned its face over the years, in the hollow silence of her home after Thomas had died, in the long hours she spent at her son's bedside, desperately trying to keep him from following the same path. The grief of losing someone you loved, the grief of being left behind, was something that consumed you from the inside out. It was a wound that never healed, no matter how much time passed. And when that grief was tied to power, to the kind of magic that flowed through Lyra's veins, it became something terrifying. Lyra's powers were the physical manifestation of that pain. When the princess was overwhelmed with sorrow, the magic in her body spiraled, uncontrollable and violent. She couldn't see it, couldn't understand it, but Mara did. She saw it for what it was, a child who had lost everything and had no way of processing that loss. Mara didn't know how long it took, but she eventually stopped trying to fix Lyra. She wasn't there to stop the tears or silence the screams. What Lyra needed wasn't another healer, another caretaker who would try to control her, to bend her to the rules of the castle. What Lyra needed was someone who could simply be there, someone who understood that grief couldn't be conquered with magic or power. It had to be allowed to run its course. So Mara continued to sit by Lyra's side. She didn't say anything when the princess cried. She didn't try to make her feel better or force her to talk. Instead, she stayed, quiet, steady, and unwavering. Sometimes she hummed the lullaby she had sung to her son, the same one she had sung in that cold room to calm the princess for the first time. Other times, she simply watched. She watched Lyra struggle, watched her tears flow, watched her power surge and crash against the walls, and she didn't move. It was the most difficult thing Mara had ever done. But she kept coming back, and little by little, something began to change. The first sign of progress came on a night when the storm inside Lyra's heart was at its worst. The princess had been crying for hours, her sobs filling the chamber with a desperate, aching sound. The magic swirled around her, crashing against the walls, causing the very air to vibrate with its intensity. The temperature had dropped to the point where Mara could see her breath in the air, despite the roaring fire in the hearth. It was the same pattern: scream, magic, silence, more crying. It had become predictable, and each time Mara feared the same thing, that Lyra would never be able to escape the spiral of grief that held her in its grip. But this time, Mara didn't step back. She stayed. She sat beside the princess, her heart heavy with the weight of the girl's sorrow. She hummed the lullaby again, just as she had that first night, her voice barely audible over the storm in the room. At first, nothing changed, but then a soft breath escaped Lyra's lips, and the magic, for the briefest of moments, stopped. Lyra's sobs quieted, and the room, which had been filled with so much raw emotion, became still. The temperature began to rise again, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The flames in the hearth seemed to grow a little brighter, and in the quiet that followed, Lyra, exhausted and broken, curled up beside Mara and fell asleep. It wasn't a peaceful sleep, not the kind that would come with true healing, but it was something. It was the first time in months that Lyra had slept without the nightmares or the violent magic. And for Mara, that was enough to keep coming back. As the days passed, Mara continued her quiet vigil. She never pushed Lyra, never tried to force her to speak or confront her grief. She simply sat, humbling herself to the child's pain, offering her presence as a balm. She would clean the room, hum the lullaby, and when the princess's cries started again, she would hold her ground. Lyra began to trust her, tentatively at first. There were moments when the princess's magic flared, and Mara could feel the pull of it, the weight of her sorrow crashing down on them both. But instead of shying away, Mara would reach out, metaphorically, of course. She would sit closer, offering her quiet support, letting Lyra know that someone was there, not to fix her, but to stay with her. And slowly, the magic began to recede. Lyra's outbursts became less frequent. She no longer shattered the windows with her cries or sent the castle into chaos. She was still a child, still burdened with an unimaginable grief, but Mara could see that something was shifting within her. It wasn't magic that was breaking through. It wasn't a spell or a curse lifted. It was something far simpler: empathy. Mara had lost her husband. She had almost lost her son. She knew what it was like to feel as if the world was closing in on you, as if the grief would swallow you whole. She understood Lyra in a way that no one else in the castle could. The staff, of course, noticed the change. They noticed that the princess no longer caused the walls to tremble with her rage. They noticed that she no longer shrieked into the night, that the endless crying had stopped, if only for brief moments. But they didn't understand why. They couldn't comprehend that it wasn't magic or power that had brought peace to Lyra. It was simply the presence of a woman who understood the depth of loss. A woman who wasn't afraid of the princess's pain, who didn't run when the magic began to swirl. They thought it was a coincidence, just another strange quirk of Lyra's temperament, something they would never understand. But Mara knew better. Each time she walked away from Lyra's chambers, each time she saw the princess rest, even for a moment, her heart swelled with a quiet sense of hope. Mara had been right about one thing. Grief wasn't something you could fix. It wasn't something you could simply erase with magic or words, but it was something you could walk through, step by step, if you had the courage to stay. And that's exactly what Mara did. She stayed. The connection between them was still fragile, but it was there. Lyra was beginning to open up in small ways, and though Mara could see the depth of the child's pain, she also saw the flickers of something else. Trust. It was the first step toward healing, and Mara knew that whatever came next, whatever obstacles lay ahead, she would face them the same way she always had, quietly, with strength that came not from power or magic, but from a deep well of understanding, and that was more than enough. King Alaric sat at his desk, the weight of his crown pressing down on him. His fingers lingered over the reports scattered before him, unread and unheeded. The council's demands, the letters from the neighboring territories, all of it had blurred into a dull hum in his mind. His thoughts were consumed by something far more personal, far more troubling. Lyra. The change in his daughter had been subtle at first, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't pay attention, but as the days wore on, the transformation became undeniable. The storms of grief that had once torn through the castle had lessened. Lyra's cries, once so deafening that they shattered glass and sent tremors through the stone walls, were quieter now. She still grieved, still carried the weight of her loss, but the violent magic that had once consumed her seemed to have retreated, leaving a fragile, quiet peace in its place. And Mara was the reason for it. The mortal woman who had entered his castle with nothing more than a mop and a humble spirit had done what years of powerful sorcerers and mages could not. She had calmed his daughter. She had made Lyra sleep. She had given her something that even the finest caretakers could not offer: empathy. Alaric despised himself for even considering it, but the truth gnawed at him. His pride, as a king and as a father, had been bruised by the realization that a mere servant, a woman who had no claim to power or bloodline, had brought more peace to his daughter than he or any of his mages ever could. It was an insult. His daughter, the heir to his throne, the future ruler of Wolfstone, was being cared for by a mortal. It was unthinkable. Yet, despite the rage that burned in him, Alaric couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, he was witnessing something unprecedented. The terror that had once surrounded Lyra was beginning to dissipate, not because of a spell, not because of his royal decree, but because of Mara's quiet, patient presence. There was something in the way Mara understood Lyra, something that defied logic or magic. Her approach was gentle, unassuming, unlike the forceful methods he had employed in the past. The conflict tore at him. Alaric had always been a ruler who commanded respect and obedience through strength. He had shaped the kingdom through decades of ruthless power, bending entire realms to his will. And yet here he was, watching a mortal woman with no magical abilities, no noble blood, unravel the grip of grief on his daughter. He had never been so helpless. His pride as a king and as a father warred within him. How could he allow this? How could he allow a lowly janitor to be the one to save Lyra? But the thought of what might happen if Mara left, the thought of Lyra spiraling back into her grief, her magic growing wild again, tearing the castle apart, was too much. Alaric paced his chambers restlessly, his cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. He knew what had to be done. He had to confront her. He had to end this. Whatever it was that was happening between Mara and Lyra. The idea of losing control over his daughter to a mere mortal, no less, was intolerable. His kingdom, his family, could not be bound to such weakness. That evening, as the moon rose high over the castle, casting pale light through the stained glass windows, Alaric found Mara in the corridor near Lyra's chambers. She was carrying a bucket of water, her face tired but resolute, as she always was when she performed her duties. "Mara." Alaric's voice was low, but it carried the weight of command. She froze, her hand tightening around the handle of the bucket. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside. "I need to speak with you," Alaric continued, his eyes never leaving hers. Mara set the bucket down slowly, her expression unreadable. She had heard the rumors, the whispers of the king's growing displeasure with her presence, but she didn't fear him, not like the others did. She followed him silently down the corridor to a more private room, the shadows of the castle seeming to close in around them as they walked. When the door shut behind them, Alaric turned to face her. His crimson eyes gleamed with an intensity that made the air crackle. "You," he began, his voice sharp, "have no place here." Mara straightened, her shoulders tense, but she did not step back. "I'm here for Lyra," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the weight of his gaze. "Not for you." The words hit him like a blow. Not for him. Alaric's hand clenched into a fist at his side. The nerve of this mortal woman. How dare she speak so plainly to him? He was the Wolf King. He ruled over lands, over armies, over creatures whose very names inspired terror. Yet this woman, with her simple words, had the audacity to undermine him, to act as though she was untouchable. "She's my daughter," Alaric growled, his voice low with barely contained rage. "And you, a servant with no magic, no power, no understanding of the dangers you're tampering with, you've become the center of her life. Do you think I would allow this?" Mara held his gaze without flinching. "Lyra needs me," she said quietly. "She needs someone who isn't afraid of her, someone who isn't trying to fix her. I understand her grief. I understand her pain. I'm not trying to change her. I'm just here, with her." "Your presence is a threat, not a gift," Alaric spat, his fury rising. "You are playing with forces you don't understand. My daughter is a weapon. Her magic could destroy this entire kingdom, and you think you can control it with nothing more than a song?" Mara's expression softened, her eyes filling with quiet understanding. "I'm not trying to control her, Alaric. I'm trying to help her heal, and healing doesn't come from power or control. It comes from compassion, from being there when she needs someone, from letting her know she's not alone." Alaric was momentarily taken aback, his jaw clenched, his pride fighting against the truth of her words. He had always seen strength as something you could wield, something you could conquer. But Mara was offering a different kind of strength, a quiet strength, a steady, unwavering force. And that, he realized with a pang of helplessness, was something he could never understand. "I won't leave," Mara said, her voice firm now, without hesitation. "Not unless Lyra tells me to." Alaric's eyes narrowed. This was not how it was supposed to be. He had always been the one to control everything, to bend others to his will. Yet here was this woman, this mortal woman, refusing to bow before him, refusing to cower. "You have no right to stay," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I have every right," Mara replied, her gaze unwavering. "I'm here for Lyra, not for your kingdom, not for your throne. I'm here because she needs me, and I will stay, no matter what you say." The air between them grew heavy, charged with the weight of their opposing wills. For a moment, Alaric felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. What if Mara was right? What if Lyra's salvation didn't lie in magic, in power, in control? What if it was as simple as Mara said, being there for her, offering her kindness and understanding? Alaric clenched his jaw, fighting the internal battle. He couldn't back down. Not yet, not when so much was at stake, but as he looked at Mara, standing before him with the quiet strength that had already begun to change his daughter, he knew that something had shifted. She had done something no one else could, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do next. "I will not ask again," Alaric said, his voice cold and final. "Leave, now." Mara did not hesitate. She had made her decision. "I can't. Not when she still needs me." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Alaric standing alone, his mind swirling with a storm of emotions he had never known how to navigate. Mara had chosen her path. She had chosen Lyra. And though the road ahead was uncertain, and the king's anger still simmered beneath the surface, she would not abandon the princess now, no matter the cost. The change came slowly, like the first light of dawn creeping over a horizon once shrouded in darkness. Lyra, the girl who had once seemed lost to the grief that gnawed at her soul, began to show signs of something different, something like hope. It wasn't a grand transformation, not the kind that happened with a spell or a mighty show of power. It was quieter than that, more subtle. But it was there, unmistakable, like the soft bloom of a flower pushing through cold, hard earth. For the first time in months, Lyra's tears stopped flowing as frequently. The storm inside her, though still strong, was beginning to settle, no longer raging uncontrollably. It was as though the weight of her grief had shifted, no longer suffocating her, but allowing room for something new. And with that space, something began to awaken in her, a flicker of trust, a hint of softness that had been buried deep beneath layers of sorrow. It started one evening when the shadows of the castle stretched long and dark across the stone floors. Lyra sat near the hearth, her small figure curled up in a blanket, staring into the fire. Her silver hair, once wild and untamed, now looked softer, as if she had allowed it to be brushed and cared for in Mara's presence. Her red eyes, though still heavy with sorrow, were not as cold as they once were. Mara had entered the room quietly, as she always did, her steps light but purposeful. She had learned to approach Lyra without expectation, without trying to force anything. Instead, she simply sat beside her, not saying anything at first. She had come to understand that some things didn't need to be spoken, they just needed to be felt. "Mara." Lyra's voice was soft, almost tentative, as if testing the waters. The sound of her speaking was like a breath of fresh air after a long drought. "Why do you stay?" Mara smiled gently, settling down beside the princess. She didn't have an answer, not in words, but she had always known that Lyra needed her to stay, not because of anything she could fix, but because of who she was. She wasn't there to offer solutions or magic. She was there to offer something much simpler, yet far more difficult. Her presence. "I stay because you're not alone," Mara said quietly, her voice warm with the simplicity of the truth. "And because I know that you're strong enough to get through this. You just need someone to remind you of that." Lyra turned her gaze to the fire, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, almost as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders, she let out a small, fragile laugh. "I used to believe I was strong, before all this, before I lost everything. Now, it feels like I'm just broken." Mara felt a pang in her chest. She knew that feeling too well, the ache of believing that the world had taken too much from you, the quiet realization that you would never be the same again. But she also knew something else. She knew that strength wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about surviving, even in the face of brokenness. "You're not broken, Lyra," Mara said, her voice steady and sure. "You're just healing, and that takes time." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra smiled. It was a small smile, barely a curve of her lips, but it was a smile nonetheless. And for Mara, that smile was everything. The days that followed were marked by small moments of change, each one a step forward in Lyra's healing. She no longer shut herself off from the world. She began to engage, slowly but surely. She would join Mara at the hearth, speaking to her quietly about her memories of her mother, Queen Lyra, and the life they had shared before the tragedy. It was painful, yes, but it was also a sign that Lyra was beginning to face her grief, not run from it. Sometimes, Lyra would even ask Mara about her own life, about Daniel, about the life she had before she had come to Wolfstone. It was always brief, always hesitant, but it was progress. It was trust. And one afternoon, when the sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays through the castle's great windows, Lyra did something that caught Mara completely off guard. She had been quiet for a while, sitting with her hands in her lap, staring at the silver bracelet that adorned her wrist. It was a simple thing, delicate and fine, made from the same silver that ran through the veins of Wolfstone. The material was rich with history, tied to the land itself. It was a symbol of power, but also of connection, a connection that Lyra had, until now, been unwilling to offer. She extended her hand toward Mara, her fingers trembling slightly. "I want you to have this," she said softly, her voice more confident than it had ever been before. Mara looked at the bracelet, then at Lyra, unsure if she had heard correctly. I can't accept this, Lyra," she said gently, her heart tightening. "It's yours. It's a gift from your kingdom." But Lyra shook her head. "It's not just from my kingdom. It's a piece of me. I made it," she said, her voice almost shy. "And I want you to have it, as a thank you." Mara's chest tightened as she reached out to take the bracelet. The silver felt warm against her skin, as if it had been waiting for her. This was no mere gift. It was Lyra's first act of kindness in months, a simple, quiet gesture that spoke volumes. It wasn't just the bracelet. It was the trust Lyra was beginning to place in her, the understanding that she was no longer alone in her grief. Mara smiled, her eyes soft with emotion. "Thank you, Lyra," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I'll cherish it." As the days turned into weeks, Mara continued to stay by Lyra's side, her quiet presence a constant in the princess's world. And with each passing day, the princess's transformation became more apparent. Lyra's outbursts grew less frequent. Her magic, once so wild and uncontrollable, became more contained. She still carried her grief, but it no longer ruled her. Instead, it was a part of her, a piece of her story, but it was no longer the whole story. The castle staff noticed the change, though they didn't understand it. They didn't know why the princess, who had once been a force of destruction, was now spending her days in quiet conversation with the janitor. They didn't know why the cries that had once echoed through the halls now only came in soft, fleeting moments. But they saw the princess smile more often, saw her begin to speak again, even laugh, and they wondered what had happened. None of them could have guessed that the answer lay in the simplest of things. Mara's quiet strength, her unwavering presence, and her willingness to offer the one thing Lyra had never had before: comfort without expectation. Mara's realization came one night as she watched Lyra sit by the fire, her eyes distant but peaceful. For the first time in a long time, the princess was at ease. Her shoulders no longer carried the weight of the world. She was still grieving, still healing, but there was hope in her eyes now, a flicker of something that had been lost. Mara understood then that she didn't need to fix Lyra. She didn't need to make the pain go away. What Lyra needed was simply someone who would stay with her through it. Someone who would let her feel, let her hurt, and let her heal at her own pace. That was the key. Mara had never tried to save Lyra. She had only tried to help her find her way back to herself. And in doing so, Mara had unknowingly become the anchor that held Lyra steady as she navigated the storm of grief and magic that had once consumed her. As the castle grew quieter with each passing day, Mara's presence was no longer seen as an intrusion, but as a blessing. The curse that had once held Lyra in its grip was slowly unraveling, thread by thread, as the princess began to reclaim her life. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, there was a light in Lyra's eyes, a light that would guide her out of the darkness. And Mara, despite the challenges ahead, knew she would be there for Lyra, just as she always had been. Because healing didn't come from magic or power, it came from something far more powerful: love. The air in Wolfstone Castle had never felt heavier than it did that night. It began as a whisper, a faint crack in the air, almost imperceptible, like the calm before a storm. The temperature dropped as though the walls themselves were freezing, and an unnatural stillness settled over the halls, a quiet dread that seemed to permeate everything. Mara had noticed the change, though she had no way of knowing what was coming. For the first time in weeks, Lyra hadn't come to her for their evening session. She had been silent all day, retreating into the solitude of her chambers. At first, Mara had thought it was just a momentary respite from the emotional turmoil Lyra had been enduring. But the silence was different this time. Heavy, oppressive. Mara stood by the hearth, absent-mindedly cleaning the room, when she heard it, the faintest sob, rising from deep within the castle. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze. She knew that sound. It was the same cry she had heard so many times before, the cry of a girl lost to grief, the cry of Lyra. Mara didn't waste a second. She grabbed her mop and hurried toward the source of the sound, her heart racing with both anticipation and fear. She had seen Lyra's progress, had felt the growing warmth between them, but this was different. When she reached Lyra's chambers, the door was ajar, and the air inside was thick with an unrelenting chill. The fire in the hearth had long since died, the once vibrant flames reduced to embers. "Lyra," Mara called softly, stepping inside. The girl was curled up on the floor, her silver hair wild around her face, her small hands clutching her knees to her chest. Her back was arched, her body trembling as if every part of her was being torn apart from the inside. Mara's heart sank. This wasn't the peaceful, quiet Lyra she had come to know. This was the Lyra who had first arrived at Wolfstone, a girl consumed by grief and magic, a girl who had destroyed everything in her path without even realizing it. "Lyra, it's all right," Mara whispered, moving closer. She knelt down, reaching out to touch the princess's shoulder. "I'm here. You're not alone." Lyra's head snapped up, her eyes glowing with the same red light that had terrified everyone in the castle. The magic swirled around her, dark and uncontrolled, crackling like a storm. The very walls of the castle seemed to tremble, and the floor beneath Mara's feet cracked, a deep rumble echoing through the stone. The sound of it was deafening. The curse, it seemed, had returned with a vengeance. "No, no!" Lyra screamed, her voice breaking as the power inside her spiraled out of control. "I don't want to be like this. I don't want this power. I don't want to hurt anyone." Mara felt the energy in the room shift. It was like a storm cloud had descended upon them, heavy and violent. The force of it sent Mara stumbling backward, the air pressing against her chest as if it were too thick to breathe. Lyra's grief had consumed her once again. And with it, her magic had erupted, more powerful and uncontrollable than ever before. The stone walls groaned under the pressure. The windows shattered in a spray of glass, and the earth itself seemed to crack beneath the weight of Lyra's grief. The magic was no longer just emotional, it was physical, destructive. Lyra's power was tied to her pain, and when that pain reached its peak, the entire castle would feel it. Mara's heart raced as she watched the destruction unfold. She had seen Lyra's grief before, but never like this, never with such force. The girl was in agony, and her pain was bleeding into everything around her. For a moment, Mara hesitated. Fear crawled up her spine, whispering in her ear that this was beyond anything she could handle, that this wasn't something a lullaby could fix. But then, she saw it, the fear in Lyra's eyes, the desperation that mirrored her own. Lyra was not a monster. She was a child who had lost everything, just as Mara had. Without a second thought, Mara stepped forward again. She had no magic, no power to stop this, but she had something else. She had the only thing Lyra needed, someone who would stand by her side, no matter how dark the storm became. Mara's voice broke the silence, soft and steady, just like it had that first night. She hummed the lullaby, a simple song, a melody that had once soothed her own son to sleep. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if it could calm the storm that raged inside Lyra, but it was all she had. As she sang, Mara felt the magic pushing back, the weight of it pressing down on her like a vice. Each note she sang seemed to drain the very life from her, her body weakening with each passing second. The warmth that had once filled her was slowly slipping away, replaced by a bone-deep cold that spread through her limbs. But she didn't stop. She couldn't, for Lyra. The air grew colder with each note. Mara's body trembled, her legs weak beneath her as she fought to stay on her feet. She could feel the energy draining from her, the pull of the curse latching onto her soul as it had once latched onto Lyra. The more she sang, the more she gave of herself, and yet the curse fought back harder. She had never felt so drained, so utterly powerless, but she kept going. She could see it in Lyra's eyes, the flicker of recognition, the way the princess's face softened for the first time in what felt like forever. The power was still there, swirling around them like a tempest, but it was beginning to subside, just a little. Lyra's breathing slowed, and the magic that had once threatened to destroy the castle began to quiet. Mara's vision blurred. The strength in her body was gone, but she held on, humming through the pain. She couldn't stop, not now, and then, just as she thought she couldn't take another breath, it happened. The storm inside Lyra began to dissipate, fading into the silence of the room. The magic withdrew, leaving only the faintest traces in the air. The trembling of the walls stopped, the earth stopped cracking beneath them, and, in the stillness that followed, Mara allowed herself to collapse to the floor, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been slowly consuming her. Lyra was still crying, her body shaking with the aftershocks of the outburst, but the power was gone. The air felt different, calmer. Mara couldn't bring herself to speak. She was too tired, too weak, but her heart swelled with relief. She had done it. She had helped her. It wasn't until later that Mara realized just how much she had risked. Her body was drained, her strength gone, and her limbs felt as though they were made of lead. But in that moment, when Lyra's magic had begun to quiet, she had felt something else. The warmth of a connection, the glimmer of trust that had been forged between them. And then, standing at the threshold of the chamber, a figure appeared. King Alaric. He had been watching from a distance, his eyes fixed on Mara as she sang, as she drained the life from herself to calm his daughter. He had seen the full extent of the sacrifice, the quiet strength of the mortal woman who had dared to stand against a force of magic that even he couldn't control. For the first time, Alaric understood. He understood the depth of Mara's love for his daughter, the way she had given everything for Lyra's sake. It wasn't magic. It wasn't power. It was something far more human, something far more real, and for the first time, Alaric found himself questioning everything he had believed. He had seen the destruction that Lyra's grief could cause, but he had never seen the power of compassion, the strength of a mother's love. Mara had proven something to him that night. She had shown him that there was more to life than power, more to healing than magic. And though he had fought against her presence, though he had resented her for being the one to help his daughter, he couldn't deny it any longer. She was the key. Alaric stepped into the room, his footsteps heavy but deliberate. His eyes, once filled with disdain, now held something different, something softer. "You," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "have done something I couldn't." Mara looked up, too weak to stand. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I only did what I had to." The king's gaze softened. "No, you did something far more than that." Mara closed her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had done it for Lyra. She had done it because it was the only thing she could do, but perhaps, just perhaps, she had done it for herself too. And as Alaric stood there, watching her with a new understanding in his eyes, Mara realized that she hadn't just calmed Lyra's storm, she had also begun to change the course of her own life. For better or for worse, the bond between them had been forged, and it was stronger than any curse. The castle was quiet in the days that followed the violent outburst. Too quiet. There was a lingering tension in the air, as if the entire kingdom were holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, to break, or to settle. For Alaric, the weight of his daughter's condition pressed down on him with a new sense of urgency. The destruction Lyra had unleashed, though momentarily contained, was far from over. The cause was as clear as it was elusive. Grief. But not just any grief, something much darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows for years, waiting for the right moment to surface. Master Aldrich, the royal scholar, had been a fixture in Wolfstone Castle for centuries. His wisdom, his knowledge of ancient magic and bloodlines, had been sought after by kings and queens alike. He was the one who had kept the records of Wolfstone's history, the one who had studied the mysteries of the royal family's lineage. And now, he was the one who would reveal the true source of Lyra's power. Alaric stood before him in the royal study, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the room. Aldrich's face was etched with the weight of centuries, his pale eyes dark with the burden of knowledge. "What do you know about the curse?" Alaric's voice was hard, but there was a tremor beneath it, a mix of anger and fear that he could not shake. Aldrich leaned back in his chair, his gnarled fingers tapping the side of his desk as if contemplating how much to reveal, how much Alaric was ready to hear. "I know much," Aldrich said softly, his voice carrying the weight of ancient secrets. "But there is one thing you must understand. Lyra's grief is not just grief. It is power, yes, but it is also a curse." Alaric's heart clenched at the word. The curse. He had always known there was something unnatural about Lyra's magic, something beyond the ordinary scope of grief or sorrow. But to hear it confirmed, to hear the truth of it spoken aloud, sent a chill through him. "What curse?" Alaric asked, his voice barely a whisper. Aldrich sighed and stood, moving slowly to a nearby shelf where he pulled down an ancient tome. It was thick with dust, the edges of the pages frayed with age. He opened it carefully, turning the pages as if searching for something. When he found it, he placed it on the desk before Alaric. "Her mother's death was no accident," Aldrich began, his voice grave. "It was orchestrated by those who feared the power Lyra would one day wield. You see, Alaric, your bloodline is not ordinary. It is ancient, powerful. And when you took a human wife, a woman like Queen Lyra, you bridged two worlds, immortal and mortal. And that union created a child who would one day have the potential to break all the rules." Alaric felt a sharp pang in his chest at the mention of his late wife. Lyra. Her death had been the catalyst for Lyra's grief, the reason for everything that had spiraled out of control. But he had always believed it had been an accident, an unfortunate, senseless loss. "You're saying someone wanted her dead?" Alaric's voice was thick with disbelief. "Who would want to harm my family? My wife?" "Not just your wife, Alaric," Aldrich replied, his eyes meeting the king's with an unsettling depth. "They wanted to control your daughter, your bloodline. There are those who believe that Lyra's power could unseat them, could shift the balance of power in the realms. They knew that once she reached a certain age, Lyra's power would be more than they could control, so they took measures to ensure she would never rise to her full potential." Alaric stood in stunned silence, his fists clenched at his sides. His mind raced. The conspiracy, the manipulation, it was all coming into focus now. The nobles, the whispers, the lies that had surrounded his family for so long. "They killed Lyra," Alaric said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They murdered her so they could control Lyra." Aldrich nodded, his expression somber. "Yes, and they didn't stop there. After Lyra's death, they bound Lyra's grief to her power. They fed her pain, and in turn, her magic became twisted, uncontrollable. It became a weapon. Her grief is not just emotional, Alaric. It is the key to her magic. It is the key to a power that could destroy the very foundation of the realms." Alaric's mind spun. He had always known that Lyra's grief was something deeper, something that could not be fixed with words or spells. But to hear the full extent of the curse, to understand just how far-reaching it was, shook him to his core. "Who are they?" Alaric demanded, his voice low and filled with rage. "Who did this to my family?" "They are the ones who hold the power in the shadows," Aldrich replied, his voice cold. "The ones who manipulate the laws of blood and magic from the darkness. You know them as the Council of the 12, the most powerful families in the realms. They've existed for centuries, shaping the course of history, controlling who rises and falls, and they feared Lyra. They feared the bloodline you and Lyra created." Alaric's blood boiled at the mention of the council. He had always known that politics, that power, had a way of creeping into every corner of his kingdom, but to think that they had manipulated his family's grief, that they had orchestrated his wife's death, was beyond comprehension. "They will pay for this," Alaric swore, his voice filled with ice. "No one harms my family and gets away with it." Aldrich didn't look at him, instead turning his gaze back to the ancient tome on his desk. "It's not that simple, Alaric. The curse is deep. To undo it will require more than just vengeance. It will require a sacrifice." Alaric felt his stomach churn at the thought. He had already lost so much. His wife, his peace, and now his daughter's soul seemed to be slipping away from him, twisted by the very magic that had been born of their bloodline. What more could he lose? As the days passed, the weight of Aldrich's revelation lingered in the back of Alaric's mind. His anger, his desire for retribution was strong, but it was tempered by something else. A new, quiet realization that his daughter was not lost. She was not beyond saving. Lyra's progress, though still fragile, had continued. With Mara's continued presence, the princess's magic was no longer a weapon of destruction. It was becoming something more controlled, more deliberate. There were still moments of grief, moments when the pain of losing her mother threatened to overwhelm her, but she was beginning to reclaim herself. It was in these quiet moments that Alaric saw the truth. Lyra was not the monster the council had feared. She was a child who had been broken by grief, by the weight of a curse placed upon her by those who sought to control her. And she deserved more than just to be a weapon. She deserved a chance to heal. One evening, as Mara sat by Lyra's side, offering her the quiet comfort she had given every night since her arrival, Alaric stood in the doorway, watching them. His heart, once hardened by loss and anger, softened as he watched Mara gently brush the silver strands of Lyra's hair away from her face, her actions tender, full of quiet strength. It was then that Alaric knew. He had sworn vengeance on those who had wronged his family, but now he understood that what his daughter needed most was not retribution, it was peace, it was healing, and with Mara's help, he would give her that. "I have made my decision," Alaric said, his voice cutting through the quiet of the room. Mara looked up, her face soft with exhaustion but filled with a sense of quiet resolve. "Your decision?" "I will confront the council," Alaric said, his voice firm, "and I will free my daughter from this curse. I will stop at nothing to ensure that no one harms her again." Lyra's eyes lifted slowly, the faintest flicker of understanding passing through them. For the first time in a long time, she looked at her father not with fear, but with something that resembled trust. And as Alaric looked back at her, he realized that the true battle had only just begun. But for the first time in years, he wasn't facing it alone. The castle of Wolfstone had been bathed in darkness for far too long. Alaric stood at the balcony of his chamber, his gaze cast over the sprawling kingdom below, the moonlight casting a cold glow over the stone walls and towers. The air was heavy with the scent of impending change, the promise of something new, something born from pain, loss, and, at long last, redemption. The events of the past weeks had been a whirlwind of discovery and turmoil, and now, at the heart of it all, stood his daughter. Lyra, the princess who had once been consumed by her grief, was no longer the fragile, broken girl who had arrived at Wolfstone. She was stronger now, more in control, and with each passing day he could see her becoming the woman she was always meant to be, the ruler she would one day be. But the kingdom's healing would not come without its final battle. The council had arrived, just as Aldrich had predicted. They came not with words, but with weapons, forces sent to reclaim the power they had long feared. These were the same forces that had orchestrated the death of Queen Lyra, that had bound Lyra's magic to the grief she had carried for so long. They had tried to destroy her before she could reach her full potential, and now they sought to finish what they had started. But this time, they would not succeed. Lyra had changed. She had gained control of the magic that once consumed her, the grief that had once threatened to drown her. With Mara by her side, she had learned to channel her emotions, her pain, into something far more powerful than sorrow. Her magic was no longer a force of destruction. It had become a tool of protection, a tool of strength. And as the council's forces advanced toward the castle, it was time for Lyra to step into her role, not as a fragile princess, but as a powerful leader. The first sign of trouble came in the early hours of the morning. A sharp, echoing crack reverberated through the castle, followed by a low rumble. The walls trembled under the force of the incoming attack. Alaric, already awake and prepared, hurried to Lyra's chambers. Mara was there, standing at the threshold, her expression unreadable but filled with determination. Lyra, her face pale but resolute, was already standing by the window, her hands clenched at her sides. "They're here," Lyra whispered, her voice tinged with a quiet anger. "They've come to take me." Alaric stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "No, Lyra. This time, we fight, together." The room was charged with tension, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. For years, Alaric had fought battles for his kingdom. He had crushed rebellions, commanded armies, and conquered nations. But this battle for his daughter's freedom, for the soul of his kingdom, was unlike anything he had ever faced. Mara stepped forward, her eyes steady as she looked at the father and daughter. "We're not alone in this. We've come this far. Now we finish it." The castle walls shook as the enemy closed in. The forces of the council had brought more than just soldiers. They had brought dark magic, the same kind of magic that had once bound Lyra's grief. But Lyra was no longer the frightened child who had once cowered from her own power. She was the daughter of the Wolf King, and she would not be controlled by anyone. With a wave of her hand, the air crackled with energy. Her magic surged forth, a bright, blinding light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. The very earth beneath the castle rumbled as Lyra summoned her power, using it to defend herself and her father from the oncoming forces. Alaric stood beside her, sword drawn, his presence a pillar of strength. He had always fought with force, with the weight of his royal blood and the might of his armies. But this time, he fought with something deeper, something more personal. This battle was not for land or riches. It was for his daughter. And for the first time, he understood that his true strength came not from his power, but from the love he held for her. Mara stood behind them, her heart pounding with each strike of Lyra's magic, but she didn't falter. She had fought her own battles, her own personal struggles. She had come to Wolfstone with nothing but the desire to help a grieving child, and now, as the battle raged around them, she knew that she was a part of something greater. She was part of Lyra's healing, part of her redemption, and as Lyra's magic collided with the enemy forces, Mara stepped forward, her eyes locked on the battlefield. She had come this far, and she would not turn away now. The battle raged for hours, the castle's halls echoing with the sounds of magic and steel clashing. The forces of the council were powerful, but they had underestimated Lyra's strength. They had underestimated the bond between her and Mara, the quiet strength that had grown between them. With every strike of Lyra's magic, the enemy forces faltered, their dark spells dissipating into the air like smoke. The ground cracked beneath them, the earth itself rebelling against the power they sought to control. And then, with a final surge of energy, Lyra's magic exploded outward in a brilliant flash of light. The castle shook violently, the very foundation trembling as the last of the council's forces were thrown back. The air cleared, and the battlefield fell silent. Lyra, her breathing heavy, stood at the center of it all, her power still humming in the air around her. She had done it. She had faced the darkness, both within herself and without, and she had triumphed. As the dust settled and the sounds of battle faded, Alaric moved toward his daughter, his heart swelling with pride. She was no longer the broken girl who had once been consumed by her grief. She was strong, capable, and ready to take her place as the future ruler of Wolfstone. Mara approached quietly, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. She had seen Lyra's transformation firsthand, had witnessed the quiet, determined strength that had blossomed in her. And though she had never sought recognition, she knew deep down that she had played a part in this victory. She had helped Lyra find her strength. She had helped her heal. Alaric turned to her, his gaze softening. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice full of gratitude. "Without you, I don't think she would have made it." Mara nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I didn't do it alone," she said quietly. "Lyra's strength comes from within. I just helped her see it." The kingdom was healing. The curse that had once bound Lyra, that had plagued her for so long, was finally broken. The power that had once been destructive was now a force for good, channeled by Lyra's will and guided by the love and support she had received. The magic that had been tied to grief was now tied to strength, strength that came from love, from acceptance, and from healing. Lyra stood at the balcony of the castle, her eyes looking out over the kingdom she would one day rule. The sun had risen for the first time in years, the light spilling across the land in golden rays. The kingdom had been in shadow for so long, but now it was finally bathed in light. And Lyra was no longer just the princess of Wolfstone. She was its future queen. Mara stood beside her, her heart full as she watched the dawn break over the land. She had done what she came here to do. She had healed the princess. She had helped her find her way, but now it was time for her to go. She turned to Lyra, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their time together had come to an end. "I've done what I needed to do," she said softly. "It's time for you to step into your role now, Lyra. You're ready." Lyra looked up at her, her eyes filled with gratitude and a quiet sadness. "Will you leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mara smiled gently, her heart aching. "Yes, but I'll always be here if you need me." And as she turned to leave, she knew that she had done something far greater than she had ever imagined. She had helped Lyra become the leader she was meant to be, and in doing so, she had found her own redemption. The sun rose higher, casting its light over Wolfstone, and with it came a new beginning for both the Wolf King and his daughter. The healing had begun, the curse was gone, and the kingdom was free.